Hello and welcome to the Children's Advocacy Forum. This is Sosamma Samuel-Burnett, founder and president of G.L.O.B.A.L.Justice, and Global is so pleased to present to you this forum on World Children's Day. World Children's Day is an opportunity for us to commemorate the Convention on the Rights of the Child, a critical human rights treaty that supports the promotion of human rights for children all over the world. This Children's Advocacy Forum is an opportunity for us not only to celebrate World Children's Day, but to highlight an issue that's so important to children, education. We'll be featuring our fellow in education policy, Vanessa Ruiz Salazar, who'll be sharing her research on social emotional learning and its impacts on vulnerable student populations. This particular forum is a presentation in partnership with our Children's Advocacy Project. And in that context, we'll be introducing you in a moment to our Children's Advocacy Project Associate, as well as our presenter. This forum, throughout this time together, is an opportunity for you in our audience to join us in questions and answers. Throughout the program, you have an opportunity to submit your comments and your questions through the question bar that's on your screen. We also encourage you to turn off all other programs that are on your computer so you have the best audiovisual experience this evening. And now, without further ado, I want to introduce you to our project associate, Greer Newman. Welcome, Greer. You're joining us from the Bay Area in California. And Greer Newman, as I mentioned, is our project associate for the Children's Advocacy Project. And Greer, tell us a little bit about what this project is about for global justice.
Yes, thank you, Sosamma. It's so great to be here. As Sosamma mentioned, I'm the project associate for Children's Advocacy, and what this project does is it serves to protect the rights of this most vulnerable population, children who are disproportionately affected by political, economic, and social disparities around the globe.
Wonderful. And then you're partnering on this event on Children's Day, on World Children's Day. So tell us sort of the significance of this day in the context of your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So this day in 1959 was the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the UN actually signed and adopted the Declaration on the Rights of the Child, providing just human rights protections for children that were previously not there. And this just happened in 1959. So the importance of doing this today is great because children are individuals, they're humans that have rights, and they have many vulnerabilities. They can't speak up for themselves or advocate for themselves. So the UN recognizing this and nations across the globe recognizing the importance and the value that a child can bring to the world is a really special occasion to honor and commemorate.
That's awesome. And we have to say that children have so much potential to impact our world. They're not always the ones that we hear their voices, but their voices count, as you mentioned, and they can make change in this world, and they are our future. So we are particularly glad that you're doing what you're doing in the Children's Advocacy Project, and we're also so happy to be able to partner and present this particular forum today. So thank you so much for being with us, Greer. We'll see you again a little bit later in the program.
Absolutely. Thank you.
We also want to welcome our featured presenter, and our featured presenter is Vanessa Ruiz Salazar. And Vanessa, would you come join me on screen now? Vanessa is the assistant principal at Lemon Grove Academy Middle School in the San Diego area. And Vanessa has been a key person in our new fellowship program. Global launched this about a year ago. And this fellowship program allows people who are in advanced positions and in advanced education to have a little space and place to be able to explore key topics and to research intensely on issues of justice with the support of our organization. So we were so pleased that Vanessa was one of our first fellows this year. So Vanessa, tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us a sense of your background and a little bit of your current work.
Yes, thank you so much, Sosamma, and thank you for everyone who is here today. A little bit of my background. So I have been in education for the past 6 years. I was previously a high school teacher, a math teacher, an AVID teacher, and it was during my time during Teach for America where I became a passionate educator and one who really wanted to fight for what was right for students. During my time as a high school teacher, I got to see real time what was going on in the lives of my students, and I wanted to be able to better equip them with the stuff that they needed to be successful. Currently, I am the assistant principal at Lemon Grove Academy Middle School, where I have been in charge of basically figuring out how to run school given the current situations that we're in now. And with a team of great leaders determined to really bring what students need at the forefront, we've kind of came together to figure out how to maneuver through the current situations.
Well, and that probably sets some context for why you decided to do this fellowship. So tell us a little bit about why the fellowship and why this particular project.
Yes. So I chose the specific topic of social emotional learning because now more than ever, we see our students, specifically from vulnerable populations, really struggling with balancing their academics and various emotional needs that they have given these times. And so during my research, I was really kind of honing into the community that I'm serving and working with, and recognizing that the voices of my students need to be heard. And they were calling out for more than just academic support, but more an in-depth understanding of how to really thrive and be able to address the needs they have emotionally.
You know, we were excited about this project, you know, long before COVID-19. But now that we have COVID-19 as sort of a reality everywhere in our country, tell us a little bit about how that has influenced this project that you're about to present.
Yeah, I think so. Right as I began doing this research, I think it kind of all clashed together. And with the pandemic going on, I think it just elevated the need for kids to be able to be supported, supported through their social emotional health. Students have been in a situation that no other group has been in. There's not really a lot of people that they can go to for support during this time, and they're kind of maneuvering through this whole distance learning on their own, and recognizing that need, and kind of recognizing as well the historical needs of these vulnerable populations now more than ever, given the current situation and how COVID-19 is affecting our vulnerable populations more than ever. There has been a need to make sure that the adults in the room, the adults in the classroom, have what they need to meet the emotional needs of our students.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you so much, Vanessa. We are thrilled that you served as the fellow with us, but we're also looking forward to your presentation. And for our live audience, if you are just joining us, we want to welcome you to the Children's Advocacy Forum. And this particular forum is featuring our fellow in education policy, Vanessa Ruiz Salazar. Vanessa will be presenting on her research related to social emotional learning and its impact on vulnerable student populations. And so I'm now going to leave the screen so that we can have an opportunity to hear from Vanessa. Vanessa, thank you, and we'll be back with you shortly.
Again, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. I truly appreciate you taking your time on a Friday afternoon to come hear about what I have to say about how social emotional learning can really uplift our vulnerable populations. In our time today, we're going to go over the history of inequity in American public schools, kind of dive into the dual purpose of education, kind of hone in on the purpose of this specific study, and really break down those social and emotional learning standards for our vulnerable populations, understanding that social emotional learning has to go hand in hand with culturally responsive teaching, and also break down what teachers need in order to be successful through this process, given our current pandemic and situation. We'll get started with defining what social emotional learning is. So for those of you who are in education right now, we've probably heard the word social emotional learning. Well, I really want to break down some of the general descriptions of what it is. Social emotional learning is an integral part of our education and our human development. It's the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, the skills, and the attitude to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and cognitive goals, and also be able to show empathy towards others by establishing and maintaining supportive relationships and making responsible and caring decisions. As we think about what social emotional learning is, I want to show you a quick video to kind of set the context as to why I decided to research this topic.
The things that people said were shocking. The things that they did, the threats that they made were all terrifying. I was glad I had on those sunglasses. At least some people would not see me crying.
Our schools are more segregated now than they were, in the late 70s and 80s. That is so backward from the trajectory of our country.
It's simply par for the course. See, I was born in 1941, and I saw the craziness around me then. It's the same craziness I see around me now.
Carry me home when the light in my eyes does fade.
In my world, not too much has changed.
People didn't dismantle Brown versus the Board of Education. People moved their children. People voted with their feet.
I've spent enough time in the hallways and classrooms of segregated schools to see the way that it just crushes the opportunities of these kids. They know that there are other schools with white kids. They know that those schools tend to have better things than they have.
I know kids in my class that got arrested that summer before they even got to high school, and they never had that teacher that really cared. So you have underqualified teachers plus underserved schools, and you expect the kids to do well. And usually the people that have to face this issue are young Black or Latino or minority kids.
The idea that we can create equitable schools in a segregated society is a myth. Show me where it's happening. It's not happening anywhere. We're one of the few countries in the world that systematically and deliberately spends less money to educate poor children than affluent children.
But you can still walk into a high school in Los Angeles, regardless of the color of your skin. But I will tell you, you cannot walk into AP courses and you cannot have the best equipped school. So while the front door is open, the classroom door still remains a real impactful problem.
Quietly, I feel you whisper salute. Quietly.
I want to have children one day, and I want my children to go to a school that's racially diverse, that's socioeconomically diverse, that's categorically high achieving. And I'm looking around Arkansas and I'm not seeing a good example. So guess what that means? I better provide one.
So I don't know how it is we're going to be the United States of America if we continue to put our kids in situations where we're constantly divided.
Quietly, I feel you whisper settle on me. Quietly, let me go.
As we saw in that video, we heard multiple stories from a variety of different educators, as well as student stories represented. We need to recognize, before we kind of engage in what social emotional learning is, we need to recognize and acknowledge the history of American public schools. We need to acknowledge the things that they have done well, but also the ways in which that they have hindered our Brown and Black students. Going back all the way to 1954, from the Supreme Court's decision to rule against segregation in public schools. We think about what our Brown and Black students have experienced historically and how the systems we currently have either continue to hold them back or are preventing them from truly achieving what they can to be successful. Understanding the history of segregation in our public schools, from the Lemon Grove incident to the Little Rock 9, is an essential component to really understanding why this need for social emotional learning is there. Ultimately, educational equity is achieved when all students receive the resources, the opportunities, the skills, and the knowledge they need to be successful in our society. And as we think about social emotional learning, recognizing the history and our history here will just continue to fuel us to continue to move forward so that we are able to provide for our students. As we think about the Little Rock 9, we recognize that this was a monumental point in our time, in our history. After the Board v. Brown of Education landmark case went through, we think of what our students, our Brown and Black students, faced in American public schools. While they were going through the process of desegregating, our kids still experience a lot of harm and hurt. And we think about the students and the students' experience and the experience of the Little Rock Nine. We have to continue to ask ourselves, how can we truly transform education so that all students, regardless of their background, are able to be successful? A quote by Sonia Sotomayor once said that until we get equity in education, we won't have an equal society. And I want you to really ponder on that, because equity in education, we really need to understand, what does this word equity mean, right? What does it mean? It's more than just a buzzword right now in education, but it really has to be a lens by which we make all of our decisions. So going to the dual purpose of education, I want to kind of emphasize that for years, policymakers and taxpayers recognize that public schools have to be held accountable, and how they spend their money and the resources that they use are essential. But understanding that the dual purpose of education is one which is academic as well as social. Students benefit from being able to be in an environment where their academic needs are met, but also their social emotional needs. Our students have seen too many times going through standardized tests and various different loopholes. But at the end of the day, if we're not able to meet the emotional needs of our students aren't going to be ready to truly receive what they need from those rigorous academics. So to get us started, I want to show you a quick video on a student's experience here in public school in the United States.
Growing up in the neighborhood that I grew up in, there wasn't really a lot of opportunities. It was either you be a sports player or a dope dealer, or you end up dead or incarcerated. The school that I went to was in Southwest Little Rock. All the kids from all the bad neighborhoods were there. So like, I had to fight every day I walked to school, fight every day I walked home. Then my stepdad and my mom kind of were going through real tough times in their relationships. So I mean, it was just like chaotic. So when I got to school, I was just like, I don't care about learning. These teachers don't understand what I'm going through. They don't even try to understand what I'm going through. And it was clear that they didn't. And when my brother died in 2008, it was like, Bradley, you gotta get it together. He came from the exact same place that I came from, and he didn't get the proper education that he needed. He ended up dying with a part-time job at Taco Bell. And I don't want to end up like that. And there was one teacher that stuck out to me the most, and her name was Mrs. Norman. And she just pulled me aside one day. She was like, none of these teachers ever asked you where you from. But she kind of became my one-on-one mentor and my counselor. She kind of the reason why I started caring more about school. Education just really gave me a driving force. It's really turned my life around, made me look at things more positively. And I'm still a poor kid, but I'm making it. No matter what nobody ever tells you, education is always the key. That's what I'm gonna do. I just won't give nobody a reason to doubt me. Nobody a reason to say, Bradley, you can't make it, or Bradley, you can't change the world, because I'm just going to change the world. I'm just going to do it. That's it.
The experience of this student, we can hear in his voice and his passion to be successful, his drive to want to do everything possible to provide a better life for himself and his family. The students that walk into our classrooms on a daily basis bring so much in. And as you heard from the video, the importance of building those positive relationships with students. Social emotional learning offers the powerful means for students to be able to support one another, but what it really focuses on, and the culminating aspect of social emotional learning, is not truly building those authentic relations with other adults and students on campus. When a student comes to school and they know that they are loved and that they are cared for, they are able to really begin to start to unpack various situations and issues that are going on. And now more than ever, we need to understand how to demonstrate empathy and resiliency to build these relationships across distance and be able to collectively come together to support our schools, all founding on relationships. And so again, the purpose of my study really comes from the testimonies of these students and the need to be able to create a cohesive plan for educators around social emotional learning. As we begin to look at the research questions, I kind of focused my research around 3 specific areas. What elements of social emotional learning are displayed in current distant learning models? How does social emotional learning affect students' effort or ability to achieve academically? And why is social emotional learning important for equity in education? And these 3 questions kind of fueled and guided my research during my time as a fellow. I want to begin by breaking down the components of social emotional learning. So as we can see from this graphic, the center, there are 5 major areas or characteristics that need to come through when we're working with social emotional curriculum and instruction. And when we're working with our students, the 5 specific areas include self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And I want to challenge us to add another layer of culturally responsive social emotional learning, recognizing that our social emotional learning is not another way to police our brown and black students, but a way to truly empower them in their classrooms, in their schools, and in their homes and community. And as the adults in the room and the educators in the classroom, we need to take our part in terms of really breaking it down the curriculum and instruction so that it can lead to and build into the school-wide practices and policies that ultimately go into and form the community partnerships that we have with our schools and our communities and our families. I want to show you some data taken from the California dashboard. So this is, again, specifically to the California dashboard to better define what vulnerable populations mean and who are these students we are specifically talking about. This data is specifically looking at the suspension rate here in California public schools. And as we can see, the categories that are vulnerable populations are our foster youth, our African American students, our homeless, and students who come from a variety of different backgrounds, including American Indian, English learners, Latinos, students of 2 or more races, Pacific Islanders, and those who fall under the category of socially disadvantaged and students with disabilities. Although a number of student circumstances can fall into this category of vulnerable, the students who live in chronic poverty, homelessness, students who have mental health issues, and students that are currently in our foster care system are some of our most vulnerable populations who now more than ever before truly need to build those meaningful relationships and better understand those 5 specific areas so that they can be successful and truly excel in their academics. And I want to break down kind of another layer of the vulnerable populations. As we think of social emotional learning with the lens of culturally responsive and equitable approaches, we need to recognize the school to prison pipeline that exists here in the United States. As we can see, due to various policies such as zero tolerance discipline, our Black and Brown students are getting suspended at a far more rate than any other demographic. Currently, Black students represent 31% of students that are in school related arrests or in school suspensions. And when we think about the vulnerable population and we think about our students who are experiencing the most trauma right now, we need to take it as a call to action. Our students are truly begging for us to find ways to be able to support them both academically and social emotionally so that we can tear down the school to prison pipeline and ensure that all of our students are able to be successful and have what they need because of their specific needs and experience. And so because of the outraging data that tells us the need for this social emotional learning, we need to consider as educators and adults, how can we move forward in truly addressing the needs of these vulnerable populations? And that begins with understanding our critical consciousness. When we talk about critical consciousness, It is an organization's way of examining and really critiquing and diving into the assumptions that they have and the biases that they carry, so that we're able to understand that this social problem is no longer just a misfortune or something that students experience, but it truly is an injustice. Students in vulnerable populations experiencing traumatic experiences and environments need us to recognize our critical consciousness so we can be aware of what we're doing as educators, as leaders in our community, to really partner with and stand behind and push our students forward. So I want to take us to a chart that focuses on the 3 different C's of social emotional learning: the conditions, the competencies, and the character. When we think about the conditions, social emotional learning will only be as successful as the positive school climate and culture that is created. Thinking about the moment a student steps foot on a campus, how are all aspects of that school community really striving and pushing to make sure that there is a positive climate where students feel loved and valued, and they know that the adults on campus are there to support them. It begins by developing a team of equity-minded leaders who are willing to fight for this positive school culture and climate, and really understand which ways is the climate conducive to learning and which ways is it prohibiting our students from vulnerable populations to be successful. And after we examine those conditions and we recognize, I think a huge part of understanding the positive school culture is giving students voice, giving students the opportunity to be able to share how they feel on campus, to be able to have a safe place to talk and share. And that leads us to our next C, the competency. Social emotional learning will only be as successful as the adults who are instructing it. It needs to come from a clear, cohesive plan of implementation where social emotional instructions have clear targeted ways of implementation, where the teachers on campus and the administrators feel ready and able to lead these lessons and engage in these difficult conversations with students. This instruction of social emotional learning, it has to take place more than just once a week. It truly has to be weaved into the essence of the school, from the way a teacher shakes their student's hand or socially distanced acknowledges the student when they're walking into campus, to the way that they interact with them in all aspects. Teaching those 5 main components are essential, but how we interact with students, how all adults interact with students and are prepared to be able to have those conversations is going to be more essential than ever. And then really breaking down into the character, the traits of individual students, and this is such a key component. We need to recognize who are our students in the room and elevate their voice in social emotional learning, recognizing that if it's not culturally responsive, it's not going to be as far-reaching. We need to make sure that social emotional learning recognizes the voices and the beautiful diversity that exists in our classrooms. Now, as we think about culturally responsive social emotional learning, I mentioned briefly what culturally responsive means. And on the next slide, we'll see that culturally responsive learning truly requires educators, adults on campus to use the students' culture, their background, their ethnicity, their gender, their socioeconomic standings, all aspects of the identity that students carry as a starting point for developing those social emotional skills. The foundation of this process is based in the understanding that our cultural similarities and differences is what leads us to develop our critical social consciousness about the world around us. As the adults in the room reflect on their identities and what that means coming into the classroom, we also ask our students, what do our students need? As adults, are we acknowledging the variety and the beautiful cultures that are in our classroom and ensuring that the modalities that we're using to teach social emotional instruction is sensitive to the various identities that our students hold? Understanding that social emotional learning absolutely has to begin in the context of culture and identity, and recognizes that it needs to be responsive and willing to adjust and adapt as we grow together as a community with our students at our school. And so as we go on to really understand the teacher training aspect, I want to challenge us to really kind of jump into the minds of teachers. It can be difficult to understand the complexities of identity and how culturally relevant instruction looks like and what it sounds like. For teachers, it's going to require them to be able to really keep culture at the center of how they think and they live. And at times it may be difficult. It may be difficult to understand, but being willing and able to start this process, to answer these questions, to engage in these conversations, because the values and the beliefs around how one interacts with our students, it's gonna be at the forefront. And so teacher training begins with self. As a teacher, as an educator, as an adult in the room, we have to be aware of the implicit biases that we bring into the classroom, because without knowing, these biases can do a lot of harm. And so as we think about training teachers, it starts with acknowledging the self, understanding and wrestling with the multiple identities and aspects of your own culture and your own background and your own experience, and thinking and applying that to a multi-level understanding of what social emotional learning needs to look like for your specific students. As culturally responsive educators, our goal is to tap into the identity causing students to feel engaged and have that sense of belonging. And the sense of belonging can only occur through authentic conversations and authentic care and genuine mutual respect for one another. Educators will be able to engage in emotional talks with their students and be able to really break down those barriers, recognizing that so much of social emotional instruction and learning takes place in breaking down the barriers, being able to help students feel vulnerable and safe to be able to have conversations around who they aspire to be and the things that they want to accomplish. Our social world, as we think about, again, the biases that exist and the environment that we're currently experiencing here in the United States, truly uplifting the voices of our students. At the center of our work as teachers, we need to know that the voices of our students are heard in all aspects. So again, beginning with the self, and then moving forward into truly diving into the research behind how to make students feel and be a part of the community. So I want to break down another level of teacher training that's essential, that goes hand in hand with culturally responsive social emotional learning, is recognizing the trauma that exists within our vulnerable populations and how we as educators can truly build relationships and ensure that we are not re-traumatizing our students by asking them to think through lived experience of pain. So we need to really evaluate, how are we allowing students to be heard, and how are we giving students a voice and agency in this process? We need to ensure that there is a emotionally safe place for students to be able to share and express their feelings and be able to truly come together as a community. And again, this doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen overnight, but as educators, when we understand the relationship of what hurts between the systems of oppression that exist in our schools, how are we actively dismantling those various systems and taking down the obstacles that exist for our vulnerable populations? We need to understand basically the role and the impact of the trauma in our students' lives and in the lives of our students and their communities around them. So kind of going through the re-traumatization into the social emotional curriculum, I want to take us to a meta-analysis that was conducted on our social emotional curriculum that really focused on demonstrating what happens when quality social emotional instruction is able to come to life and be cultivated on a campus. They found that not only do students feel safer on campus and a sense of joy and belongingness, but they perform better academically. When a student is able to come into a classroom and feel connected to a community, willing and ready to jump into the academic performance and able to really explore in addition to that, providing different attitudes and behaviors. They found increased improvement in the students' overall behavior and attitude towards school. A newfound joy in education was reinstilled when students' emotional needs were met. And they found that there were less negative behaviors associated once students were able to really self-actualize and understand at their core what was making them frustrated or angry or upset. They were able to negate those negative behaviors and truly come and have conversations around what specifically was hurting them or what was getting in the way of them being successful. And ultimately, it led to a reduce in emotional distress. And as we know from hearing the news and hearing the voices of our students, especially in the current situation we are with the pandemic and COVID-19, the stress and the anxiety levels of our students that are at all-time high. And I want to show you a quick video with some of those students and their responses to how they feel in the current situation.
That in some ways I'm like less optimistic considering how it's been progressing.
Quarantine has kind of been like an endless void of nothingness, doing nothing all the time.
I'm definitely doing better now than I was in the beginning of quarantine. I just felt really helpless about the whole situation, and I was upset and irritable all the time.
Earlier in quarantine, I had some pretty like scary mental health stuff go down, and so that was pretty frightening, and now it's pretty much under control. I think it's starting to feel more real now.
It's starting to feel normal, which is completely unbelievable because this is not a normal situation at all.
Every day is just blurring together because it's just nonstop, the same routine. I just feel kind of trapped and kind of stressed.
It's insane that this is what's happening, that this is like where the world is at.
I've just been pretty sad, and I've been really lazy, and I've been pretty bored.
I'm doing less creative things than I was doing at the beginning. Because at the beginning I was sort of like, okay, I'm set, let's go. I'm ready to do these things to make me feel better. But now I'm kind of just like chilling.
It's very hard to like stay motivated, and it's incredibly easy to just like get behind and to get distracted.
I'm getting way more work than I was, and my motivation is just at zero to do any of it.
Everything's past fails with no incentive to work really hard doing it.
I've been getting super behind on my schoolwork because I can't really focus in Zoom. Then I kind of feel like school isn't real or it doesn't like count. So I get like super behind on all my homework, and then I have so many assignments to do, and I just be super stressed out about it.
The hardest part about quarantine is not being able to see my friends because I really haven't seen them in like a month and a half, which is really just crazy.
Weekends are getting very lonely.
I miss my friends a lot, but I found new ways to communicate with them, and I started talking to them more often.
Self-isolation, like I feel like I'm going crazy inside of my own house.
The thing that scares me most right now is if someone in my family gets
70% of the population is going to be infected. That could be any one of my family members tomorrow or today.
A couple of my neighbors actually got corona.
A friend of mine's father actually passed away.
My grandparents got coronavirus. My grandma loves to come over. She loves to garden in our yard and help out whatever she can. But like I'm so worried for her. If somebody you love gets it, it's just like really scary at first.
Something that scares me right now is how we're going to return back to normal life after quarantine.
I just want to know if it's going to get better or if it's going to get worse, or like how long this is going to last for, if I'm even going to have school next year.
Students' responses, we can truly see what kids are wrestling with right now. COVID-19 has dramatically shifted education and the way students have experienced learning. And now more than ever, we need to really buckle down and be able to understand how to address the loneliness, the anxiety, the depression, the fear that is currently going through the minds of our young people. And as we think about that, understanding the level of as we think about a return or what school is supposed to look like after this, we really need to understand the principles of trauma-informed approach. That for students who've been out of school for an entire academic year, how can we rebuild that sense of safety, that trust, the sense of trustworthiness, and being able to be transparent and build that peer support. I really want to hone in on that peer support. When I'm at school and I'm hearing the stories of students, they are longing for that peer support, the interaction that they haven't had for months. Being able to connect with their friends has really, not being able to connect with their friends has really taken a toll on their mental health. We see a lot of students right now in a state of loneliness, and they're not exactly sure what to do. So when we're thinking about the importance of social emotional learning, if our students are lonely and they're struggling to really understand and grapple with the academics, I think we need to really reconsider, where are we putting the most of our time? If we're able to really build in those relationships where kids are no longer feeling as much anxiety or as much loneliness, then at that point they'll be willing to hone in on their academics. That peer support is essential, and now a lot of students aren't able to really have those experiences. And then really kind of moving towards collaboration. So an approach of like, how can we cultivate multiple opportunities for collaboration to exist given the current situation we're in. Oftentimes I'll be in classrooms and I'll see muted cameras off and mute button on, and we see that students are not necessarily engaging in as much collaboration as they used to. And so how much of it is because they have not had that peer support and connection? Ultimately, we want to be able to get to the point where we're able to truly empower the voice of our students. For a student to be able to wrestle with the difficult feelings that they currently have and express it to a trusted adult, because that will really move forward in this progress, because we don't really know how long we're going to be here for. And ultimately, and always recognizing the cultural and the historical issues that exist for specific vulnerable populations. If we think about how COVID-19 is affecting the Latinx and Black community more substantially than any other specific demographic, we really need to understand that next level of trauma. We have families that live in multi-home with multi-generations, and the sense of fear around how this virus is going to impact their family, they bring into their classroom on a daily basis. So that leads me to a couple of my recommendations as we move forward. So when thinking about social emotional learning for our vulnerable populations, education is one way that we are able to meet the emotional needs of our students by implementing creative and healthy ways for our students to engage in dialogue and conversation. That's one way. Being able to really equip our teachers, being able to provide them with the trainings and the tools necessary to be able to successfully facilitate conversations around various issues our students are having, and giving them a trajectory, a directional point and focus, and always bringing that directional point and focus back to the community that the community that the school serves. As educational leaders, we need to refocus our attention on how we're taking an equity lens to social emotional learning to ensure that we're not doing more harm than harm in the situation, making sure that we're aware of our communities that we serve and the variety of different cultures and backgrounds of our students, so that we're able to truly meet the emotional needs of our vulnerable youth. From a government perspective, right now there are in all 50 states, there are social emotional standards and policies in place, but continually putting this at the forefront, recognizing that without the social emotional instruction and attention and money placed on this specific curriculum, we'll we need to understand the implementation process of it and also how it ties in with academics, right? Not just looking at race, not just getting students to be able to achieve or perform on a standardized test, but we will get students, all students, to achieve and perform if we're able to meet the emotional needs that they're bringing into the classroom so that they're able to access those rigorous instruction. And then thinking as a community, how can we truly come together right now to uplift the voices of our young ones and recognize that now more than ever they're struggling with loneliness? How can we come alongside and really lend a hand and be able to support families and parents through this process, whether obviously we're socially distanced and not able to meet together, but how are you able to go to the vulnerable ones, checking on the young ones in your life, checking on the students who are in elementary school and middle school and high school and college, and how are you checking in with them? How are you checking to see if they need someone to talk to, if they need resources for specific situations that they are in? How are we reaching out to our young people right now? So I want to leave you guys with that. How are you reaching out to the young people in your life and equipping them with what they need to be successful and being a voice for the vulnerable? Thank you.
Well, Vanessa, thank you so much for sharing your presentation. There was just so much there for us to think about and process. I think the timeliness of this presentation, it speaks for itself. There's just so much happening in our world today, especially with COVID-19, to affect the emotional and social status of so many children, but especially those that are in vulnerable conditions. So I want to take a few minutes just to acknowledge our live audience. And for those of you who've been watching, I want to encourage you to join us now in some Q&A with Vanessa. She has put a lot of time and energy into her research and also into this presentation. I want to let you all know that this PowerPoint presentation is reflective of a larger research paper that she's completed, which can be found on our website, and we'll give you instructions to reach that later. What I wanted to encourage you to do now is use your chat box to make any comments or any questions that you have for Vanessa, and we'll take those questions as we can and in the time that we have. So Vanessa, I'm going to get us started with just a couple of general questions. So your background started with an education in public policy, and then you went into education, and you grew up in the Sacramento region, and then now you're working in San Diego in a primarily Latino community. Tell me a little bit about how this sort of juxtaposition of your education and education experiences with these different environments and different realities that you stepped into.
Yeah. So I think about the work that I did as a public policy student, passionate about fighting for justice and being able to truly dive into what it means, what are various human rights violations and what are different situations happening. And in my studies and in my research, it came to one of the ways that I was able to make the most impact was through education, by being in the classroom with students, by being able to be there in the trenches, hand in hand with our kids and our public schools. And as I transitioned from Northern California into the San Diego region, which is demographically very different than up north, I just recognized that immediately, the need to be able to ensure that students, regardless of their status or regardless of the financial status, they need to be able to have the opportunities that all other students in affluent backgrounds have. And I think when I came face to face with the inequities that exist in low-income schools, it frustrated me. It made me frustrated and asked the question, why? Why do these Latinx and Black students, why are they not getting the same education? And the things as basic as like sports or lunch food or just different opportunities to engage in internships or ways for them to be able to take AP classes. And again, that frustrated me, and it was kind of the motivation and fuel for me to go into educational leadership, because I saw the vast inequities that existed in public schools and thinking about education as that great equalizer, right? Well, if these kids aren't given an opportunity from the start, how is this supposed to be the great equalizer that gets them to be able to be competitive on the global market and being able to be competitive in the society that we live in now if they're not even given the classroom door of getting into an AP class isn't even an option. And so as an educator, wrestling with that, and also fighting for different ways for my students to get those resources, those were kind of the daily battles. And I realized that there wasn't a solution. It was going to be a constant fight. And every day I go to work, I'm constantly fighting to ensure that all of my students have access and are able to really receive that quality education, because they deserve it. And I believe that it's their human right to be able to have that quality education.
You know, so much of what you shared is really, it resonates on so many levels. But you know, one of the first videos you showed the Little Rock Nine, and the comments from those women who lived that. You know, they were those children who did not have access to that education, and when they finally had the opportunity, the different barriers that they faced, the adversity that they faced in order to just have that education. So in a sense, what you're describing sounds very similar, that there are still kids today, maybe not quite the same context as what you saw with Little Rock Nine, but similar types of barriers that make it so hard for them just to get there, let alone be there and to access the education. So we really appreciate what you're doing in that front. Now, this presentation had a lot of different elements, and there's a few questions that I want to start, sharing with you. One of the questions is, it's so challenging. Okay, this is really challenging, and it's not things that we can do instantly. It takes time to implement these types of programs and opportunities. What do you feel is sort of the first hurdle, the first thing that we need to address in order to start moving and progressing in social emotional learning for these vulnerable populations?
I think the first hurdle is the self, recognizing what you're bringing into the situation, acknowledging the biases that we all have, and how are those either perpetuating systems of inequity, or in which way are our biases actually putting forward specific situations and ideas. And I think that it all begins with self-reflection and the willingness, the daily decision to step into this difficult work, knowing that it's not going to get easier, but the why behind why it's so important. If you knew that social emotional instruction, meeting the needs, the emotional needs of your student, was going to make them be able to be successful and access those rigorous academics, as educators who love our students, we're only going to want what's best. And so if it means wrestling with things that we're not certain or that we've never really dealt with before, if it means that our students are going to be successful, then we need to continue to put that fight in and put that foot forward and really focus in on those positive, caring relationships, uplifting the voices of our students in our classroom.
That's great. And I think the educators have such a high hurdle sometimes, to do what they do, and they certainly need the supports that are in the community. And I want to start talking a little bit about that. So, the family, that's one element. What would you share in terms of how families can be of support or be part of this process of supporting these students and these educators for that matter?
Yeah, I think families, it begins with just opening our heart to being acceptant of others, from people who may not have the similar experience or background or cultural identity that we hold, but allowing kids to be able to interact and see at a young age the beautiful aspects of being a part of a diverse population, where the skin color the color of your skin doesn't matter, like whether or not you're friends with them, or the type of hair, or the type of clothes you wear, or what kind of fancy lunch you get to have, that you're breaking down those barriers from the beginning and helping your children understand that in this world, our diversity is what makes us beautiful. And from a young age, having conversations with students and exposing them to literature and stories about the historical situations that exist. And I think being able to have the conversation at the table with your own family, but also willing to kind of put that action into place. Like, in which ways are you reaching out to the hurting communities? How is your family able to come around and support those vulnerable populations and vulnerable students that are in all of our schools, in all of our neighborhoods? And how are we able to really reach out with genuine, authentic love for one another, especially during these times, especially in the polarized world that we're living in now? How can we really reach out with authentic love and care?
I think that's wonderful input, and especially for the family as a kind of an initial unit to be able to instill those values in the student and then sort of reflect it out in their educational experience. What strikes me, and this is a tough question, is that there are a lot of families that are broken, that have all sorts of challenges that make it, very difficult for them to maybe have some of those opportunities. So that brings in the community element. You've mentioned a few recommendations regarding the community. How does the community come alongside kids that are in those vulnerable spots, whether it's, not having a home, or whether it's not having adequate basic services and, food, or whether it's not having the parents there or others to give them those supports. So how does the community address those needs when, when the family unit is not there to do that?
Right. And I think that's what a lot of our public schools are experiencing now more than ever, especially given the pandemic and the situation where starting with like our school community, we're no longer just providing textbooks and school supplies, but we really need to take a multi-level approach to how are we addressing the needs of all of our students. I'm thinking about my school right now. We're delivering turkeys to families who need extra food. We're connecting them with other community partners. And I think it starts with just asking the community members, the partners, whether they're small businesses, whether they're large organizations, being authentic and open with various situations that our community is facing, and really building that partnership built on the understanding that we want our community, we want all individuals in our community to have what they need to be able to continue moving forward, to continue to fighting that good fight, and to be able to know where to go. And I think thinking about the community partners that exist, making yourself available to local public schools is a great way to start. We just did a GPA celebration at my school, and the pizza guy down the way, we reached out and we said, we have these amazing students who have done great things given distance learning, and I'd love to be able to just partner with you. How can your small business, whatever you can donate, however you can help, to create experiences that students, even in this time, feel cared for and loved. And I think it definitely starts with kind of internally reflecting, or what are ways that we can reach out? What are ways that we can give? We all have God-given talents and gifts deposited in us, and sometimes it's uncomfortable to be able to step out and offer that, especially given the times that we're in. But it's now more than ever necessary for every single person to self-reflect and determine, like, in what way can I give to these vulnerable populations? How can I lend a helping hand? How can I build bridges between community partners and schools and churches and various different individuals in the community to really hone in and recognize that our kids are hurting, and especially our students, especially our Latinx and our Black students, and our students are foster and homeless. They're hurting right now. And closing your door and just going to bed in your comfy, nice house, we have to recognize the privilege that we have now, even being able to sit here and listen to a webinar. Like we have so much privilege, and how are we using the privilege that we are given to really ensure and give back to our communities that are hurting?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I wanted to take that government layer a little bit too, because a lot of times people do look to the government in many ways, and education is a large part of government funding. I'm located in Colorado, you're in California. We both know that education is a major part of the budget of each of these states, and that's the case in many places. But that doesn't mean that even with a large budget share that we have good things happening in education. So just from your perspective, both as educator but also administrator, what do you think the government has done well in terms of education, and particularly in the social emotional learning aspect, and where are the areas where you feel like the government really needs to improve?
Right. And I think in recent years, or most recently, prioritizing and at least starting the conversation around social emotional learning. If you think back 3, 4, 5 years ago, this conversation wasn't at the forefront of educators. And whether it's a private school or a public school or a charter school, we do hear the need to be able to address the social emotional learning of our students. And I think what various policies and states have done in terms of at least having standards built around social emotional curriculum instruction is a good step in the right direction. I think looking at more of a state and local level, how are school districts prioritizing that in terms of the various programs they offer or the personnel that they have. We see more than ever school districts kind of getting equity coaches or different leaders to lead MTSS or organizations that partner with organizations that reach the whole child, the different emotional needs that the student has, building a lot of those community partners we see having and occurring more often. But I think an area that they can improve in is recognizing I would go to standardized testing. If we're prioritizing social emotional instruction and now everybody is hearing about it and are learning about how to implement it, I really want to see a kind of shift in terms of why are we then placing all this emphasis on standardized tests to determine whether a student is successful? How are we creating a more multi-tier, multi-level approach to understanding what success looks like and re-examining that students who experience traumatic situations and traumatic backgrounds and looking at our historically marginalized students, like how is that life experience taken into consideration when we're defining what success means? Is success just being able to meet the checkbox, yes, you're at grade level, or is it taking a more holistic approach in terms of what does success look like for a 7th grader, an 8th grader, a 5th grader, a kindergartner, taking that whole child approach. And I would like to see that happen more in terms of the type of education policy and the standardized tests that are given across the country.
Now, you've recently come into this role of administrator, so you've been an educator for a number of years and now you're an assistant principal, and that brings you to a whole sort of another level in terms of this work. And so I want to just ask, if you're talking with another administrator, what kind of advice would you share with administrators, educational administrators, about how they can address these sort of community needs that we talked about?
Yeah. It's funny you bring this question up because this is the exact question I have all the time with administrators around how can we bring the community's needs in. And I think, again, with the buzzwords that are flying around education, we hear equity a lot. And really acknowledging what equity means is different than wearing an equity lens as a leader. That recognizing that in every single decision that you make, from operations to logistics to instruction to curriculum to ways you leverage community partners and build up parents, how are we taking an equity lens and ensuring that our students that have been historically marginalized are at the forefront of the work that we do? So I would challenge other educational leaders and administrators to never take off that equity lens, to always carry it with them and wear it in every decision that they make, from how they are reaching out to specific parent groups and providing workshops and being available. And it happens in those big decisions you make as an administrator, from big processes to put in place in terms of looking at suspension. How are we going about and making decisions around discipline and suspension? How are we really ensuring that our students that have historically been suspended at outrageous levels, how are we readjusting, reevaluating, and kind of be willing to break down barriers and breaking down systems that haven't worked for our Brown and Latinx and our Black population? How are we willing to confront those situations? And I think it also begins with having that own kind of self-reflection. What are things that I'm doing now that are not benefiting my vulnerable populations, and how can I dismantle those so that these students can specifically get what they need to be able to be successful?
Mm-hmm. I also want to take sort of the educator piece. Right now, you're an educator, I'm also an educator, and we know this is an overwhelming time for educators, right? There's so much that teachers are having to learn, whether it's on the grade school level, the high school level, or the collegiate level. Everyone is learning how to, do all this stuff online, right? And everyone's learning how to, sort of reach students in all sorts of different platforms. how would you maybe encourage educators right now, teachers, in this very difficult context to still pursue this social emotional learning?
Yeah, I think now more than educators, we need to really, now more than ever, we need to really leverage our educators and be able to equip them with what they need to be successful, because leading classes through Zoom is exhausting. And we recognize that nothing will ever replace being in the classroom with your students, being able to see their faces, being able to be near them, to talk to them. But despite the challenges, we still need to rise to the occasions, because if we look at the gaps that historically existed, those gaps still exist, and they're growing more than ever before, given our current circumstances. So I would say with educators, creating communities among other educators to at least open this conversation, to be able to wrestle with the difficult aspects of being a teacher right now, what that means, what that looks like, and have a place to share ideas. And also grow and learn and really like hone in on what your why was. Why did you get into education in the first place? Because when you're under trial and when things are getting difficult, that's when you need to refer back to what got you into education. And more than not, it's going to take it back to the kids. You got into education because you were passionate about caring and serving students, and you want all students to be successful. So given the circumstance, given your specific students that are behind those little Zoom cameras, what exactly do they need now? Do they need that conversation? Do they need a check-in, a socially distanced check-in from the porch? Do they just need a kind word, a quick opportunity for you to be able to acknowledge them? Because from those videos, we heard that a lot of our students are lonely. And so much times, like, the only interaction outside their immediate circle that our students are seeing is their educator, is their teacher. And I think if we recognize that for many of our students, their teacher's face is going to be the only other face that they talk to, how are we pouring into our students? How are we leveraging kind words, positivity, and ways to really build in and ensure that at the forefront, that before their algebra tests and their math homework and their reading, that you're prioritizing them as an individual and you're giving each and every one of them the space to be able to share, to talk, to explore. Yes.
That's wonderful. Now, I want to take the student piece a little bit, especially given a couple of those videos. I was so touched by those videos. There was one of the young man that was just going to change the world, and he will. He has that motivation. And then you saw the video of all these students that were just basically being very candid about the challenges that they're experiencing, in this COVID-19 realm. And there's sort of two questions in that. One is, how do we encourage students to support one another? Because especially in this time when they can't necessarily hang out with friends and can't be in the classroom, how are they able to do that? And then sort of a secondary piece to that is, I'm struck by the fact that there are so many students that are online and are trying their best to do things online, but there are a lot of students who don't have the ability to do that, for whatever reasons. Either they don't have the actual physical infrastructure for that, or their learning needs are so different that makes it very difficult. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to both of those pieces. You've mentioned it quite a bit in your presentation, but if you can just maybe reinforce those two sets of concerns, how students can encourage one another, but then also how do we address those students who just cannot use these online systems to do what they need to do.
Yeah, I think to the students, I would say to you, check on each other, reach out, text, call, Snapchat, Instagram, whatever you can do that in this time to check on your friends, to be able to be a soundboard for them, to be able to listen. Even if it's something as simple as like doing your homework together or not doing your homework together, and just seeing how they're doing. I'm recognizing right now a lot more than ever, my students, they just don't have any more friends. They were, especially in that 7th grade, they just came out of elementary school. They missed an entire half a semester of elementary school, so they're really like 5th graders, and they're coming into a brand new school and they don't know anybody, absolutely anybody. So thinking kind of in terms of how administrators and teachers can build those opportunities. I know for teachers it could be scary to say, kids, talk to each other, ready, go. But I think so much of that conversation that kids have, like in a breakout room where kids can talk and share and be able to connect to each other. I think our educational leaders and teachers, we play a big role in building those bridges. How can we create spaces for students to talk to one another, and picking up a phone? And I know that's scary for some of our younger generation to be able to just call and be able to check in and see, how are you doing, and having conversations. So I definitely want to challenge all of our students out there to take a risk too. Reach out to someone you've never met. Maybe you're looking at your Zoom participant list and you see the name of a student who's always has their camera shut off and they're on mute. Maybe send them a message. Just say like, hi, I'm so-and-so, and just introduce yourself, because behind those cameras are so much anxiety, fear, and loneliness. And I think it just like you would reach out on the playground and play with the person who's sitting by themselves at the table, we can still do that, even in the situation that we're in. And then really speaking to the students who are not able to access their Zoom classes. I want to challenge teachers. I know it's frustrating right now because you're like, they're not engaged, but let's really rethink like what's behind those screens. Sometimes we don't know. We don't see that a student has their 3 other siblings and they're balancing feeding their siblings and doing laundry and taking care of the household and still trying to show up to your Zoom meeting. There's a lot of the situation that we're in the households of these families. We don't know necessarily what's behind those screens, and we really need to be conscious and aware of what we're saying right now. We want to make sure that we're not tearing down our students, that even those students who only log in for 30 seconds and aren't able to turn in any of their homework and are probably not turning in any of their Google Classroom assignments, that you still understand and are aware of the multi-level and the multi-dimensional aspects of what students are wrestling with right now. Because I know students want to be back in the classroom. I know they want to be back with their teachers, but a lot of them are juggling other situations in terms of running a household, taking care of siblings, having to go to work with their parents, while at the same time being a 7th grader or a high schooler. So I think giving everybody grace in this situation and really advocating for your students who that digital divide is affecting more than ever. I would say that the squeaky wheel, I'm not sure the whole saying, but the squeaky wheel gets whatever. The whole aspect of being that advocate for students, where if you're noticing that a student's falling through the cracks, where the administrator or they're not able to give them what they need to be successful, don't give up on them. Continue to put in that email, submit that tech order, let them know that you're going to fight for this student, and that simply providing them a device is just step one. And I think given our situation, that should be a bare minimum requirement for our schools to be able to at least give our kids a seat at the table.
And one last question for you, Vanessa, before we have just a few more minutes before we conclude our time together. You know, you've spent several months working on this project now. You've had a chance to present this project. You've shared with us various recommendations. You've explained to us why it is important for us to put the emphasis on the social emotional learning, especially in the current context. But at the end of the day, if someone is watching this session and hearing your presentation or reading your paper, what do you want them to walk away with? What is that sort of one kernel that you want to make sure that they experience when they review this work that you've done?
I think I would want them to walk away with the fact that social emotional learning instruction will mean nothing if they're not authentic relationships. If there's not authentic care for one another at a human level, regardless of the various status and socioeconomic and demographics of our students, and cultural background and various components of our identity, genuine care on a human level, that's where it begins. It begins with those relationships. It begins with caring for the person next to you, to reaching out a hand for people who are in need and need that support. And the curriculum, the content, the research will come, but without those authentic relationships and that genuine love and mutual respect for one another, then it won't be as successful.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Vanessa Ruiz Salazar. I want to also invite back Greer Newman, who is our project associate for the Children's Advocacy Project. So Greer, if you want to join us back on screen, we'd love to see you again. But I want to just take a moment and just on behalf of Global Justice and as well as our Children's Advocacy Project, we want to thank our audience for being part of this session. And we want to especially thank Vanessa for her great work as our fellow in education policy. She has shared much more than education policy here. She's shared a really sort of societal perspective in many different ways. And I want to also bring in Greer's perspective, as a project associate in children's advocacy, and just get some of your input, Greer, in terms of what you've heard in this presentation, how you feel it's applicable to the work that we do at Global, and also for this recognition of World Children's Day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a wonderful presentation, and I personally learned so much. I've been working with children myself for many, many years, and with vulnerable populations, including people with disabilities. And I was thinking about how I can apply those principles to the individuals that I've worked with. We're thinking about the foster children that I've worked with, and how resources and that social learning is so important, because I heard that lack of motivation was a really strong thing going on right now, and thinking about how can we get that motivation to happen. I think in our foster care system, I think there was a lack of motivation when you're missing that family unit to begin with. So it can only be worse now, right? And so thinking about how we can reach out as a community, as peers, encouraging fellow students to reach out. And then just thinking globally about the fact that this pandemic is so much wider reaching than just the United States, but it's across school systems in every country of the world right now are dealing with these issues. And we have immigration issues and places where children are not getting an education whatsoever, but they're dealing with the impacts and changes. And so much of it is that social, emotional wellness. And what is the priority for learning and education and the well-rounded human being, the soul and the heart of the child? Are they going to be okay after this pandemic is over if they fell a little bit behind in the classroom, if they still felt heard, if they still felt valued, and they still felt that importance of their role in society, knowing that there is a future? I heard that question, when is this going to end? What is next? Why am I even trying right now? Will I get to go to college, for those high school students and whatnot? And I think that loving on each other, right? Love thy neighbor, and to bring that well-roundedness to the child is really probably the most important thing anyone in any society or economic status can do, is to really just love and encourage and support the spirit and the soul at this point.
Thank you, Greer, so much. I think that underscored, Vanessa, the importance of this work that you've done. So I want to take a moment to thank Greer for partnering with me in presenting this Children's Advocacy Forum, especially on this World Children's Day. And I want to especially thank Vanessa Ruiz Salazar, who has done a wonderful fellowship research project on social emotional learning. Thank you for your time and your attention to this important topic and for this presentation, but more so for your work on the day-to-day as an educator and administrator working on behalf of children. The passion that you brought into the classroom and to your school was certainly clear in this presentation today. So thank you, Vanessa. And to our audience, again, we want to thank you for being part of this day of celebrating children and considering ways that we can better advance the needs of children and better address those needs so that each and every child in every place and space can thrive. So thank you so much for being part of our time together. Just a few footnotes for today. Everything that you're seeing today, we can share with you on video as well. We'll be presenting this presentation on our website, and you can find that at www.globaljusticeonline.org. And you can also visit that website to not only watch the video, but to actually read the entire research paper that Vanessa has prepared. In addition, we encourage you to follow along with us for upcoming special forums, both online and on site. Thank you so much for being part of this, and we look forward to the next opportunities to share about global justice.